My name is Ron Howell, and I teach journalism in the English department at Brooklyn College. And I'm here today because of Pia Raymond, who I call the star of Prospect Lefferts Gardens. And we're here talking about legacy, but also eating marshmallows, as some are doing now. And Pia was very, very generous, I guess maybe is the word too. She told me that I could come and share about my book I just wrote, was just published, Boss of Black Brooklyn, The Life and Times of Bertram Baker. And yes, I think the day went so well and we connected very well. It was wonderful. The book I often describe as a biography, but then as I start to tell people about it, it's clear that it's more than that it's also a memoir. And yes, it's mostly history about Nevis in the late 1800s, early 1900s, and Brooklyn in the early 1900s and mid 1900s, but it's also about a family, and specifically about my family. And I had to finally understand that it was a family that rescued me when I was a child. And I have come to understand in the last 2 decades, I would say, the significance of family and how important it is to be open to children, understanding that really the children are about us and our existence beyond the moment. And so that's what's here today, and that's why I think it was so magnificent of Pia to do it. It's like she intuits all this and has it in her spirit, and she speaks so easily and honestly as she talks about the issues that I feel are really part of the book. And so I'm very just grateful to be here today. That's a very, very good question. I think some of it was natural in his upbringing. He would always speak very highly, especially of his mother's family. He was raised by his grandmother, actually, in Nevis. The family surname was DeGrasse. And yeah, I think a lot of it was just there in him. And in fact, the grandmother at a certain point, precisely 1914-15, decided that he was just too difficult a lad, a teenager at the time, 16 years old, 17 years old, for her to steer through life without difficulty. And she had his father take him to New York. But I've come to feel in learning about my grandfather and about his childhood that it was more than that. There was a lot of psychology there, and that, Freudian psychology, specifically the literal meaning of the word, which has to do with the relationship of a child to a father. His mother died when he was young, 2 years old. And his father left, married again, and came to Brooklyn, leaving Bertram Baker there with his grandmother. And the grandmother finally told the father that he had to come pick Bertram up in 1915 and take him to Brooklyn with him. And it became clear to me that the son, Bertram Baker, harbored a resentment, even an anger, deep inside him toward his father. And my feeling, playing the psychologist, his biographer, was that a lot of his feistiness that came out in his dealings with family, including myself, and with those in his political club, had a relationship to his that anger that was embedded in him from his relationship with his father. Yeah, we had some discussions about that today, and part of it, yes, is that they came here with a different perspective. There's several factors, I guess. I think one is that many of them came from what were considered the upper classes in the old British Caribbean, and also had something to do, I think, with the fact that demographically it was just a different environment that they were functioning in, living in, where those who were running the retail stores, like his maternal ancestors, were people of color. And so they were not, all in prison and treated with the lack of respect that was the case in the United States, especially in the South. So it was a different environment. But what happened also was that when they came to the United States, in part because of that, they did not have the association that was very natural to native-born black Americans with the Republican Party. And the truth is, the reality of that time was that it was a Democratic Party in New York City, especially in Manhattan and in Brooklyn, that was coming into power, was taking over, running things. And it happened at a moment, he came here and politically of age, at a moment when the Democrats were really asserting themselves, and native-born blacks were still very hostile to the Republican Party. And so the West Indian blacks who came were able to enter those environments with much more ease. And I think in a very simplistic way, that helped to explain why they were able to make all of those inroads as pioneers in politics. Yes. Well, it was more from my research than his speaking about it, but he was a treasurer in the. He was with the Garvey movement and a treasurer with the. There was an organization, African American Orthodox Church, which was associated with the Garvey movement, and he was the treasurer of it. And they were working to build a church in Brooklyn, and yes, and he would go to Garvey meetings and be in parades. And this was in the 1920s when he was just starting to make his way. And yes, it helped him as he was, trying to organize blacks in Brooklyn, because there weren't lots of them there. And Garvey, in that sense, was very helpful, although, as we know, that Garvey was eventually kicked out of the country, and the association, of course, died off. But the spirit that was there stayed within Bertram Baker all through the 1930s and 40s, and was part of his rise through the Democratic Party and Brooklyn politics. And there was a little bit of both. I think that Shirley Chisholm did miss some of it because she wasn't there. Okay. And, she said some things that about accusatory and essentially, in effect, calling people of that era who were Black Uncle Toms. But the fact is that, and I call him in one of my chapters the master of compromise, and there was a great element of that in there. And I say in the book, too, that he was both Booker T. Washington and he was W.E.B. Du Bois. He was like both. And he would speak fondly of Booker T. Washington, even as I and many young blacks in the 1960s thought of Booker T. Washington as Uncle Tom. But he embraced him. But he was a guy who was also fiery, at his first job when his bosses were Irish and he didn't like the way he was treated. He stood on a chair and announced that he was quitting the job that very day, and he was insulted with his treatment, and he later on called one of the bosses a dirty dog. And I mean, he had that in him. And I think that Shirley, who really was the next generation and didn't know him very well, did not know that. Okay. Yes. I'd have thought that at first. I did. It did seem, to make sense, because journalists were, often considered, as we know today, by a certain figure in Washington, the enemy of politicians. I did feel that, and he had said things that weren't kind about journalists. But in my research, I also came to see and found articles that he had written consistently in the New York Age, which was a black newspaper, through the 1930s. And he upset the Grand Master of the Lodge of the Prince Hall Masons, which were the black Masons, who very, very significant at the time in Brooklyn and the rest of New York City and the country. And the Grand Master ordered him to stop writing the articles and to submit articles for approval before he allowed the newspaper to print them. And he said, no, I'm here, and I have the right to write and publish whatever I think is accurate. And he did, and they expelled him from the Prince Hall Masons. And I was pretty astonished learning about that. And maybe he understood that journalists can easily make enemies. And someone asked me in an interview that, well, maybe he just didn't want that to happen to me, that I would, suffer major reverses because of I felt an effort to speak truth to power. Because he did speak truth to power as a writer for a newspaper. I don't see myself in life going back and regretting things. I just don't think it helps. And the fact is, practically, it really is a waste of time, right? Because nothing we can do about it. No, it's the opposite, that I'm pleased that I learned what I did and that I spent time, and fruitful time, and even loving time with him before his death. That's the most important thing to me. Either Amazon or bookstores here in Brooklyn. There's a Greenlight bookstore, community bookstore in Park Slope, Barnes & Noble throughout the city. Or reach out to me. I have a website, bossofblackbrooklyn.com, and a Gmail account, bossofblackbrooklyn@gmail.com. And we'll work it out for sure, because it's a pleasure and an honor when people tell me they want to read the book. What's up to Marilyn for standing by me? And Marilyn is my wife, who's one of the strongest people I know. And she is the grandmother, as I am the grandfather, of three great, wonderful youngsters, Ella and her two older brothers, Oliver and Xavier. So they are so special in our lives, and their parents, my son Damani and his wife Brittany, who are both doctors, and we're proud of that. The only thing is, I'd like to get them back here living and working in Brooklyn, because they're in Connecticut.